everybody, it's Mel. Thank you for joining me today. We are going to talk about all the books that I read throughout the month of January. So I have decided that for my wrap-ups, I will not include any of the stats, and then in the video where I go through my diversity game, I will also talk about the stats. So that's the plan going forward for each of my monthly wrap-ups and for the stats. But I will just say that I did read 7 books in the month of January. As I go through and chat about them, they're in the order in which, well, essentially in which I put them in the journal, which isn't actually even the order in which I finished them, but that's how we're going to go. So the first book that is in my journal that I'm going to talk about today, The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. I gave this book 3 stars. It was fine. I had a good time reading it, but overall I thought the premise was pretty stupid, and I thought it was, in general, fairly contrived, the storyline, but I thought that it was decently written and I did enjoy myself while I was reading. I had fun, but because I do still feel like the whole idea of it was pretty stupid, I can't really give it more than 3 stars. So it's a middle of the road book for me. It is a enemies to lovers fake dating romance. It is about Olive and Ethan. Olive and Ethan's brother and sister are in a relationship and getting married. Olive and Ethan have known each other for a long time because they met via their brother and sister. However, they've never gotten along. Something happened when they first met, and it basically is the reason why they've never gotten along. Ethan's brother is marrying Olive's sister. So Olive's sister is called Amelia or Amy. I can't remember what the brother is called. But on their wedding day, they got everything about the wedding they got for really cheap. So there was a lot of stuff that they kind of couldn't get out of and that they just had to kind of go with, including the food that is there. It ends up being that the only 2 people at the entire wedding who don't get food poisoning from the food that they eat at the wedding is Olive and Ethan, because they didn't eat it. Now, the honeymoon is a package that Amy won, so it's got very specific rules about when you can go, who can go, etc, etc. And because the only 2 people that didn't end up with food poisoning at the wedding are Olive and Ethan, who don't like each other, but they still decide that they're going to go on the honeymoon together because they don't want to waste the honeymoon. That was the premise that I heard, and I was like, well, that is ridiculous. How can you possibly not know any single other person who might potentially go on this honeymoon with you? Why would you go with the person that you absolutely can't stand? Like, yes, it's a free honeymoon for you or a free holiday for you, but surely that's going to be a horrible experience. But they decide together that because they've got this basically suite of rooms, so they'll have heaps of space there. They don't really have to spend any time together. But then on the actual honeymoon, because of a series of other events that happen on the honeymoon, they end up having to continue to pretend that they're the married couple, which is what they are doing in order to keep the honeymoon, actually the actual holiday, as theirs. But then they intend to just pretend and not pretend and then go their own way. However, because of a series of other things that happen on the honeymoon, they have to keep pretending. So yeah. So I think that's really stupid. I know that a lot of people really, really love this book, and I can understand why. I do think that it was fun. I did enjoy the writing. I liked the characters, but unfortunately it just contains a lot of tropes that I really don't like. So even though I thought it was fun and I enjoyed the writing, I just couldn't get past the fact that I found the entire premise to be really stupid. I still don't think that there wouldn't be one other person that you could go on this holiday with. Now, Ethan, initially Olive was like, I don't really want to do this. But then Ethan is like, well, I'm going. And they both got offered. So they're both kind of like, well, I got offered, well, I'm going to go. Well, I got offered, well, I'm going to go. And then they end up making the decision to go together. Which I guess I can kind of understand. If someone I didn't like was like, well, I'm going to go and you can't, that's fine, you don't have to come, then I might be tempted to be like, well, no, I deserve a holiday too, which is what Olive is tempted to and does do. But I just can't get on board with the idea that you'd go with someone you hated. So from my perspective, it's completely ludicrous and unbelievable, and I can't get past why you'd put yourself in that position in the first place. And then also it has miscommunication. So the entire reason why Ethan and Olive didn't get along in the first place was a complete misunderstanding, and that felt entirely fabricated because, like, I don't know, I just can't. It was, she thought that he was reacting in a certain way because he thought something about her when they first met. Like, I from her point of view, I can kind of understand it. And then he says, well, you were always just horrible. So I guess I understand it, and I guess they didn't know each other very well, but I really dislike miscommunication as a trope. It is so often done incredibly badly. It's so often just one of those things where it's like, guys, you could have fixed that so easily if you just said two things to each other. Like, seriously? But yeah. So, yeah. All in all, like I said, I gave it 3 stars. I did have fun with it. I did read it and enjoy the experience of reading it. I'm not sad that I read it, but there just aren't enough things that are positive to outweigh some of the negatives. The next book we're going to talk about today is The Hotel Witch by Jessica Miller. This is an arc that I read through NetGalley. It's actually the first ever arc that I read, and it was an awesome one to start with because I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. So it's published by Text Publishing. They are an independent publishing house here in Australia, and it is scheduled to come out on the 7th of March in 2023. I believe here, again in Australia. I'm not sure when it will be released in other parts of the world. However, I will link Text Publishing and the information about the book in the description below. So if you want to go and check it out, then obviously please go ahead and do so. So this is a middle grade, and we follow Sybil, who is a hotel witch, or an apprentice hotel witch. So her grandmother, who she lives with in the hotel, is the hotel witch. So a hotel witch is basically a magical being, a witch, who is employed by the hotel, and they do things like find things and different things like that for the patrons at the hotel. There are a variety of different hotel witches in a variety of different hotels all around the place. They live in this magical land. I cannot remember what it's called, but I think it's essentially like our world, but with some extra countries that are magical, because they do talk about Italy and Venice, and I believe that the country is actually in Europe. But anyway, it's a magical land, and basically there's a bunch of different magical things going on, and Sybil is the apprentice to her grandmother, and she's learning how to do the magic and how to be the hotel witch. It was really, really well written. I really, really enjoyed the character of Sybil. I really enjoyed the rest of the characters. I thought that it was really fun the way that it was written, what was actually happening. The events of the story were really fun. Essentially, her grandmother goes missing. They believe her grandmother is stuck in last Tuesday, but while the grandmother is missing, Sybil essentially has to take on the role of the hotel witch and stop being an apprentice and start being the actual hotel witch. And then a bunch of different somewhat sinister things start to happen, and she has to deal with those things. Like I said, it was very well written, and yeah, it was just really fun. It was easy to read. It is a middle grade, so I found that some of the reveals about what was happening and who was perpetrating some of the bad things was quite telegraphed, so I figured it out reasonably quickly. But again, it's a middle grade. It is not aimed at adults. It is aimed at people who are, I'd say it's more of a kind of young middle grade, so it would be aimed at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. So I think that the reveals would hit perfectly for the people that it's intended at. That is why I gave it a 4 stars, because I really didn't think that I could give it a higher rating, because I did guess some things, but I definitely wasn't going to give it a lower rating because I am not the intended audience. So as long as the intended audience don't necessarily guess it or care if they did as well, is the other thing, I think it wouldn't be a problem at all. I really enjoyed the magic system in this as well. It's quite sort of domestic focused, but it was something that was just really interesting, something I hadn't really seen, a particular take I hadn't really seen before, which I thought was really well done. And yeah, I keep saying the writing was good. It was. I enjoyed it. It was solid. So I definitely recommend this as a book that people should check out, particularly if you have younger children who would be interested in that kind of middle grade, but just in general, I think people would really enjoy it. So yeah, that was The Hotel Witch. Next up is 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. Now, I'm not really sure how I feel about this book. I gave it a 3 stars, yeah, and it's definitely a very middle of the road book for me. I read this book as a buddy read with my friend Paige from Pages with Paige, and my friend Max, who is a classicist who works at university, and I definitely was influenced by her feelings about it. My issue with this book is I'm not really sure that it is achieving the stated aims of the author. So it's essentially a feminist retelling of the Iliad, but we do jump around a little bit and we look at some of the things that happen in the Odyssey, and we do also look at some of the things that happen prior to the events of the Iliad and also leading up to the events of the Iliad. So it does quite a little bit of jumping around, but it's definitely intended to be a feminist look at the Trojan War, which is great. But again, I just don't think that it entirely fulfilled that brief. There's lots and lots and lots of different female perspectives that we follow, which is fine, except that one of the stated aims of the author in general, maybe not specifically for this book, although I do think for this book as well, is to make classics more accessible for non-academics. I just don't think that this achieved this. There was too many stories, it jumped around too much, and it definitely relied on a certain amount of knowledge, which, if you're trying to make it more accessible to people who don't already have that information, then they can't understand it because they don't have the information. It just doesn't seem to work for me. But my main issue with the feminist retelling and why it doesn't achieve that is that, this was initially put forward by Max, but she feels that the implication is that in the Iliad and other works like the Iliad, there are no female representations. There are no points in which we look at the women who might be in the story, might be involved, and that's just simply not true. Now, none of the inclusion of women in Greek mythology would stand up to today's modern understanding of feminist theory or feminist ideas. However, there are definitely points where the female perspective is included, is looked at. Women get a voice, definitely in the Iliad, definitely in the Odyssey, but not just in those books. There are incidents in other writing, there are other authors, other poets throughout the classical era who were trying to give a voice to some of these women and give a perspective to some of these women. So yes, you couldn't argue that they were a feminist by modern standards, but you couldn't say that they 100% ignored women. And that's kind of my main issue with that, because it implies that they were ignored and completely maligned and taken out, which actually means that those incidents in the Iliad where we do actually follow Andromache quite closely, it's like they didn't happen, and that's not really the case. So I'm not sure that it really achieved what she wanted it to achieve, and I'm not sure that it's entirely fair to women of that era. But there were elements that I did enjoy. I did think that her writing was excellent and some of the characters were done really well, and some of the things were interesting to look at and interesting to see from a different kind of way of looking at it. The other thing that I kind of had issues with was the inclusion of Penelope's perspective, because that definitely was not feminist perspective on Penelope, because they were just incidences where Penelope was writing letters to Odysseus but then telling Odysseus what Odysseus had already done. It was literally like the author was just trying to say, hey, I also know about the Odyssey. I know stuff. And that just felt really pointless. So I'm saying it's 3 stars, but I'm now wondering if I need to drop one of the stars, because it might be slightly less, yeah, there's a bit more negative than there is positive. Core pile is 5.57 though, so core pile is pretty much dead in the middle because it's out of 10. So I think 3 stars is probably accurate, but it's definitely a lower 3-star. So yeah, that's that one. Then we have The Fae Keeper by HE Edgmon. This is the second book in, I think it's just called the Witch King series. I'm not 100% sure. So this is a book set in fairyland, or, well, it's a fairyland that is in our actual world, in our actual Earth, but the Fae came through from another dimension and came to Earth and kind of carved out some areas of Earth. There are different Fae kind of nations where they live, and so it's kind of their fairyland on Earth, if that makes sense. So in these books we follow the perspective of Wyatt. Wyatt is a trans man. He's a witch, so witches are the children of Fae, and they have been told that they are the, I guess, accidental mistakes. So they are not full Fae, but they still have some magic, and they have been very, very oppressed. Wyatt is one of the witches. When he was growing up, he was betrothed to, I was going to say Earl, but it's Amir. Then he ran away when a bunch of different horrible things happened. He ran away from Fairyland and ran to the human world and met Briar and moved in with Briar's family and realised that he was trans. And then Amir comes looking for him and says, basically, you still have to be engaged to me, we still need to get married, I'm about to be made king of the fairies. And Wyatt agrees to go back. So Amir is part of this rebellion who are trying to give the witches equality. A bunch of other stuff happens, but that's essentially it. This is a really interesting, what did I actually write in my journal? The author uses the premise of witches being oppressed and abused by the Fae to discuss the oppression and abuse of people in the LGBTQIA+ community. So yeah, that's essentially what's going on here. And I found that really, really interesting, and I feel like I learned a lot from these books, and I'm glad that I read it. It gave me a really interesting perspective. I gave this one 7.29 on core pile, which is 4 stars. So I really, really enjoyed this one. But I know a lot of people, I was reading this as part of the Last to Read book club, and I know that a lot of people didn't really get on with these books. And in fact, Ellie and Lana both didn't end up finishing the duology. That I can completely understand, because while it's written in the first person, it's not just that. It's written with a very, the main character has a very, very strong voice. They're in a monologue and they talk very, they swear a lot, they make little sarcastic asides to themselves all the time. I think it's quite a difficult writing style to get on board with. So yeah, it's definitely something I would recommend, but I think with the caveat of just go in preparing for a very strong writing style with the first person and a very, yeah, if that makes any sense. So anyway, that was the next book that I wanted to talk about. Then we have my favourite book of the month, and honestly, I think this is probably going to be one of my favourite books of the year. If not my favourite book of the year, I absolutely loved it, and that was Babel by RF Kuang. As you can see, I tabbed this all over the place, which is not something I do very often, but I just couldn't help it with this one. There was so much in here that I wanted to think about and remember. I could not stop thinking about this one. One of the ones I read first up in the month, so as I've kind of moved away, you know, I've stopped thinking about it quite as much, but I definitely still, it's still in my mind. It's definitely still something that I know will continue to be something that I'll be thinking about. Holding it right now, I would like to reread it. But I do have a lot of other things to read this month, so Probably won't, but yeah, it was just, I really, really enjoyed it. It was absolutely fantastic. So this one definitely got 5 stars. It actually got a 10 in Core Pile, which is the highest you can get. And even when I give out 5 stars in Core Pile, I often don't. In fact, I almost never give a 10. So that tells you how much I enjoyed it. I just found it so incredibly well written. I found the magic system just such an interesting magic system. I love the main character Robin. I love the other characters. I love historical fiction, so I loved that aspect of it. It's set in Oxford, and I really, really enjoyed all of the descriptions of Oxford University and attending Oxford University. So we follow Robin, and Robin is a young boy from Canton, and his entire family died in a plague that swept through Canton in it says 1836 in the back here, but it would be like 20 years earlier, so early 1800s. And then this man from the UK, from Oxford University, comes and heals him and takes him back to Hampstead Heath in London and adopts this boy Robin. Robin names himself Robin, and he tutors him in lots of different topics, specifically languages, and then he sends him up to Oxford University to attend the Translation Institute of Babel, which is the foremost translation institute around the world. Now, the magic system in this is just phenomenal. What did I write in my journal? It uses the disparity between a literal translation of words and the actual meaning that is intended, and the disparity between those things, the concept that is added or taken away when you translate from one thing to the other, is the actual magic. And that just blew my mind. I just thought that was so unbelievably clever and so interesting. It was not something I'd ever come across before, and I just thought it was amazing. Oxford, and Babel specifically, being the foremost translation centre in the world, has complete control over this magic. The actual mineral, the silver that they use in order to create this magic and control this magic. So in the UK, people are using silver to change the colours of, have lights in their lounge room that changes colour every 10 minutes. Whereas there are people in Canton and other places of the world that are poor, who don't have this, don't even have enough silver to stop people from dying of the plague. So it's definitely a comment on capitalism and on colonialism and on imperialism, which I thought was done really, really well. But yeah, I just overall thought this was fantastic. I thought it was incredibly clever, incredibly well written. I'm so glad that I read it. I'm so glad that I read it with my friend Michelle. We had some great conversations about it. Definitely one I want to come back to, and definitely something that I just think was really meaningful and just really fantastic. So yeah, that is Babel. Then I have Rhapsodic by Thalassa. This is the first book in the Bargainer trilogy, and it is very different from the book we just talked about. I think this is probably a new adult. I definitely wouldn't say this was young adult, but it felt very young. I'm not sure how old the main character is actually supposed to be, but she definitely felt like she was in her early 20s. So we follow our main character, whose name I have entirely forgotten. Let's see if I've written it somewhere. I have not. But anyway, we follow our main character, and she is a siren. So it's, again, a kind of paranormal romance. And she's a siren, and when she was in her mid-teens, she was living with her stepfather, who was very abusive. And one night she completely lost her control and she killed him, and then she freaks out and she calls on the Bargainer, and the Bargainer is some kind of supernatural being. It's not immediately stated what type of supernatural being, but some type of supernatural being who essentially collects favours. So people call on him to do something, to fix something, to change something, and he does so, but the cost is a favour. So she calls on him to kind of try and fix the problem of her having killed her stepfather. And he does, and she starts collecting favours. Now she then starts calling on him for a variety of different reasons, and she now owes him a ridiculous, like 300 and above favours. And then she doesn't hear from him for like 7 or 8 years, and then all of a sudden he returns and starts calling on the favours. There's a lot more going on than that, but that is all I'm going to say for now. So it is a romance. Like I said, it's paranormal romance. I had a lot of fun with it. I was a little bit nervous about it because I'm not really I'm becoming a romance reader. I'm definitely getting much more into romance. As you guys know, I've been doing a vlog that I keep mentioning but haven't released yet. So this was my first kind of paranormal romance, and something that was supposed to be a little bit darker. So I was a bit nervous about it, but I did really enjoy it. It wasn't super dark. I think it potentially will get darker as the series continues. This first one wasn't super dark, but yeah, I did enjoy it. I had a lot of fun with it. I gave it 3.5 stars, and for core pile that was 6.86, I think I've written here. The final book that I want to talk to you about today is Seasparrow by Kristen Cashore. This is the final book, at the moment anyway, in the Graceling series, which I have been reading as a read-along with Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany and Tara from Wild Book Garden. So thank you so much to those two amazing people for joining me and for co-hosting, and thank you to everyone else who has been joining us in the read-along. We had a lot of fun with this read-along. We really enjoyed all the books that we read. This one probably is my least favourite of the series, although I did really enjoy it. I can't remember what star rating or what core pile rating I gave this one. So I did enjoy this one, but I found it was a little bit too long. It's 600 odd pages long, and there were long stretches where we were travelling through the ice, travelling on a ship, and it got a little bit repetitive and it just kind of dragged a little bit. But as per usual, Kristen Cashore's character work was impeccable. It was told from the perspective of Harva, who is one of the characters that was in both Bitterblue and Winterkeep, but we are getting her perspective now. And we're following a group of people that went with Bitterblue to Winterkeep, and we're following them on the way back from Winterkeep. And on the way back, they run into a storm and the ship sinks, and they end up in the frozen icelands in the far north, and they have to travel back down to the part of the world where Bitterblue is from. I didn't feel like it was the end of a series, which is the other thing that I found. It wasn't quite up to the standard. It didn't feel like an ending of a series, so that was a little bit of a letdown, and it was a little bit long, and there was areas that dragged. But the character work was amazing. I loved being in Harva's head. I loved some of the conversations around trauma, and the way that we looked at what Harva had been through and how that was affecting her, and the long-term effects that trauma can have even without people realizing it. And I thought that was really interesting and really well done. So definitely wasn't my favorite, but still really enjoyed it, and definitely still really love Kristen Cashore's writing style and her character work. So yeah, that is the final book that I was going to talk to you about today, and that is my wrap up. So comment below and let me know what you read in the month of January. Did you read any of the books that I read? Have you at all in general read any of the books that I read? What did you think of them? What was your favourite book that you read in the month of January? And yeah, just comment anything about your reading in January or about the books I read and what your perspective is in the comments below. If you'd like to leave me a comment but you don't know what, then leave me a building emoji, because we have Babel and it's the Tower of Babel. All of my social media details are listed in the description below. If you'd like to go and follow me on any of those other platforms, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would absolutely love it if you would subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. And yeah, like I said, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.